It's 2018, and Liberia is celebrating like it just won the World Cup. Crowds flood the streets, singing the praises of the man they believe will save their nation. George Weah, the only African to ever win the Ballon d'Or, has just become president. This guy was the miracle child of the slums who conquered the football world, and now the people believed he would conquer their nation's problems as well. But as the crowd celebrated, they didn't know that they were cheering for a story that would take quite the devastating turn. Because the same victory that united the nation would soon lead to one of the greatest economic collapses and national crises in its history. This is the story of how the hero who inspired millions soon became the villain of his own story. Before George Weah became a global football icon or a president, he was just a little boy fighting to survive in a world stacked against him. Born on October 1st, 1966 in a community just outside Liberia's capital, Monrovia, his father made a living as one of the country's earliest heavy equipment mechanics, while his mother scraped together an income selling goods from a small stall near the waterfront. Unfortunately, Weah's parents split when he was an infant, leaving him to be raised by his deeply religious grandmother, Ma Emma Clon Brown. In her crowded home, surrounded by a dozen other children, Weah grew up in a shack in the Gibraltar slum bordering Claratown on Bushrod Island. Life there was rough, but the bond between him and Ma Emma was unshakable. He often said every achievement in his life was dedicated to her. Relatives who watched him grow insist that football was practically in his DNA. Like most kids in the neighborhood, he hustled to survive, selling popcorn, collecting bottles from trash heaps for spare change, and gambling when he could. In between all that, he spent endless hours playing barefoot street football with ragtide makeshift balls on the dusty roads of Claratown. Liberia itself was far from calm during his childhood. The country's political atmosphere was filled with unrest. In April 1980, when Weah was only 13, he witnessed a moment that scarred the nation. 13 officials from the slain President William Tolbert's administration were executed via firing squad after a coup led by Samuel Doe. Many librarians initially believed Doe's takeover would reset the nation and bring about opportunity. Even Weah later recalled that after the coup, everything felt open and they could find jobs. But that optimism collapsed as Doe soon became a ruthless authoritarian. Before football took him abroad, he worked briefly as a switchboard technician at the Liberian Telecommunications Corporation. By the early 1980s, however, his talent on the pitch was impossible to miss. He climbed rapidly through the ranks of Liberia's top clubs, starting with the Young Survivors, moving to Mighty Barrel, and eventually joining the powerhouse Invincible 11. He later described those years as non-stop football, playing from morning until night every single day. For him and many others from the slums, the field was the only place where life felt larger than their circumstances. His earnings with Invincible 11, then national champions, became a lifeline for his grandmother and the siblings he grew up alongside. Meanwhile, before Samuel Doe seized power, football in Liberia carried a stigma. It was seen as a pastime for people who had no future in school or society, something serious families discouraged. Players were dismissed as uneducated and directionless, but Doe wanted football to become a symbol of pride. Under his rule, Liberia entered World Cup qualifying campaigns for the first time in its history. Determined to prove Liberia belonged on the global stage, Doe funded a 2-month training camp in Brazil for the national team, an unbelievable opportunity at the time. Young George Weah found himself on that very trip, learning in the birthplace of football magic. Soon enough, they eventually named him captain and was known to reward the team with literal briefcases of cash after victories. It was in these years that Weah's legend began forming, and soon enough, the world began to notice him too. But what no one realized then was that this fame would eventually give him far more influence than any president could ever control. After dominating Liberia's football scene, Weah left home in late 1987 for a 3-year semi-professional contract with Tonnerre Yaoundé in Cameroon. It was there that he had his major breakthrough. Claude Leroy, coach of Cameroon's national team, saw something extraordinary in the young Liberian. Leroy quickly contacted Arsène Wenger, who was in charge of AS Monaco. Wenger flew to Cameroon, watched Weah play, and immediately understood what Leroy meant. Before long, Weah was on a plane to Europe signed by AS Monaco for €12,000, a fee that would later look laughably small for what he became. And from the very beginning, what set Weah apart wasn't just talent, It was who he was as a person. At Tonnerre Yaoundé, teammates remembered him as the quiet one who stayed after training to run extra sprints in worn-out boots. A young striker obsessed with improvement. Even then, he played with a mixture of humility and fury when he dribbled. At Monaco, his personality never changed. Wenger later said Weah was one of the most respectful players he ever coached. Modest, gentle, mental genius, almost shy off the pitch. And yet, when match day came, the guy transformed into something primitive. His first major explosion of global attention arrived in 1989, during a European Winners' Cup match against Galatasaray. This was the kind of goal only someone with his blend of power, balance, and fearlessness could score. But the goal that truly made Europe take notice came in 1994, with Paris Saint-Germain in Parc des Princes against Bayern Munich in the Champions League. Surrounded by defenders, Weah glided through a crowd of red shirts before unleashing a thunderous shot into the corner of the net, a moment now replayed endlessly in tribute videos. This was a declaration that an African striker could dominate Europe's biggest stage. Over 5 seasons with Monaco, he netted 57 goals and helped the team capture the 1991 French Cup. His explosiveness made him a fan favorite, and soon Paris Saint-Germain came calling with a lucrative offer. By 1994, Weah was once again crowned African Footballer of the Year. Then came his defining season, leading PSG to a league title, a French Cup victory, and a Champions League semi-final run in 1995. Later at AC Milan, he lifted the Serie A trophy twice and showcased abilities no other striker possessed. And in 1995, global football officially bowed to him. Ballon d'Or winner, FIFA World Player of the Year, the first and still the only African to claim both awards. Even after brief but impactful spells at Chelsea and elsewhere, his heart remained in Liberia, a nation that by then was unraveling in bloodshed and poverty. And Weah, he couldn't look away. And as Liberia descended into chaos, Weah's fame began pulling him into battles far more dangerous than anything on a football pitch. By the 1990s, Liberia had become an absolute nightmare. Warlords carved out territories with violence as their language. In 1990, rebel commander Prince Johnson captured President Samuel Doe and filmed his torture and mutilation. The state, of course, collapsed into deeper anarchy. So, George Weah tried to give the next generation a lifeline. In 1994, he created the Junior Professionals, a football team open to children from across the country with one strict rule: you must stay in school. He also began partnering with UNICEF, promoting vaccination campaigns, HIV/AIDS awareness, and emergency humanitarian work. Fresh off being crowned the world's best player in 1996, Weah used his fame to speak loudly about Liberia's suffering. He called for international intervention in interviews with foreign journalists, and then he experienced major problems. Charles Taylor's loyalists stormed his Monrovia mansion, burned it, and brutalized members of his family. One of Taylor's aides was later seen driving Weah's beloved Mercedes as a trophy. The message to the football superstar was unmistakable: stay quiet. But Weah didn't hide. He rebuilt his home, but refused to live in it again, turning it instead into King's Lodge, a housing for Liberia's national team players. He continued flying into Liberia despite the danger, handing out money on the streets, visiting hospitals, and funding education and vocational training programs. He helped with disarmament efforts and supported child soldier rehabilitation. He even built a children's hospital in Monrovia. At this point, he'd become more than an athlete. He was a beacon of hope in a country drowning in despair. But every time he returned home, he kept pondering, how long would a man loved by millions remain just a football hero, and not something far more powerful? Because soon, his fate and the Liberian people would demand something from him that would change the country forever, and ultimately rewrite his legacy in a way no one ever imagined. By the turn of the millennium, George Weah's football career was losing its shine. In less than a year, he had bounced between 3 different clubs, changed roles on the field, and quietly begun to wonder if it was time to hang up his boots. What the world didn't see was that his mind was no longer on Europe's stadiums. It was still back home in Liberia, a country bleeding from civil war. While his peers were stacking millions, Weah was emptying his own pockets. Nearly $2 million of his own personal fortune went into keeping the battered Liberian national team alive. He relocated their training camp to Ivory Coast, bankrolled their salaries, and bought everything from cleats to jerseys. By mid-2000, he went even further to become a coach, technical director, and star player all at once. In 2001, against all odds, he led Liberia on a thrilling, improbable run through the World Cup qualifiers, and all his admiration from the people irritated one man in particular: President Charles Taylor. Even though Weah insisted he had no interest in government, Taylor viewed him as a potential rival. When Liberia's World Cup dream faded, everything changed and Weah fled the country, believing that staying might mean prison or something far worse. In June 2005, at age 38, the king finally walked away from football. An all-star farewell match in Marseille honored him, but the cheers could not drown out the pull he felt from home. Liberia knew his name. Liberia knew his heart. Liberia knew his generosity. And Weah began to wonder, is the only true way to save his country to lead it? After retiring, Weah returned home and stepped directly into the political arena. In 2005, at just 39 years old, he announced his first presidential bid. At a time when Liberia was destroyed, he offered something the political class never could: authenticity. The elite panicked as many politicians tried attaching themselves to his popularity. Others launched attacks meant to discredit him. They mocked his lack of formal education. They contrasted him with his Harvard-trained opponent, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. They even attempted to have him removed from the race, citing an old French passport and portraying him as an immature celebrity who could be easily manipulated. But the ordinary citizens didn't care. In the first round of voting in October of 2005, Weah dominated with 28%, while controversially claiming he had actually won 62%. A runoff was set: Weah versus Sirleaf, under the watch of 15,000 UN peacekeepers. In the long run, the final vote gave Sirleaf 59% of the ballots, so clashes broke out between Weah's supporters and UN peacekeepers. After regional leaders intervened, Weah stepped back and accepted the international ruling that the elections were fair. Henceforth, Sirleaf became Africa's first elected female president. Defeated but not discouraged, Weah went back to humanitarian work. He funded another World Cup push for Liberia, promoted education, and continued supporting the national team. But this time, something bigger was growing. The loss in 2005 wasn't his end, and in a few years, Liberia would be calling his name again. What no one knew was how different the country would look when he finally returned for another battle. In 2014, nearly a decade after his first political heartbreak, George Weah returned this time, winning a Senate seat for Montserrado County, home to the capital. His support base had only gotten stronger, especially among the youth. 2 years later, he announced another presidential campaign. This time, he wasn't an inexperienced newcomer. He was organized and surrounded by a movement instead of just fans. The 2017 election became a showdown between Weah and Joseph Boakai, Liberia's sitting vice president. Once the ballots were counted, Weah crushed the competition, 62-38. Youth voters carried him, and Sirleaf's refusal to endorse Boakai weakened the establishment. So once again, George Weah defied the odds. On January 22, 2018, he stood before the world as President Weah, promising to defeat corruption, pay civil servants, and revive the economy. Unfortunately, something else was growing, something that would one day turn admiration into anger, because the presidency of George Weah was about to collide with a reality no amount of football glory could shield him from. And when the fall began, it shook the entire nation. When George Weah took office in January 2018, he arrived under a halo. The streets sang his name and the stadium still carried his past glory. He pledged to stamp out corruption, pay civil servants, and coax private investment back into Liberia. But after the first year of his tenure, everything changed. From day one, Weah talked like a savior. His public language was simple, emotive, and populist. Punish corruption, pay civil servants, lift the poor. He launched the pro-poor agenda for prosperity and development, a 5-year plan announced as the roadmap to lift Liberians out of poverty and to make the state responsive to ordinary people. The PAPD was like a heartfelt pledge to citizens and was frequently invoked by Weah in public addresses. But rhetoric often remained just that. Early symbolic acts, including a widely publicized 25% cut to the president's own salary, were meant to show solidarity. Yet people quickly noted that such gestures were cosmetic compared to the depth of fiscal reform that was actually needed. His decisions, which are mostly impulsive and often mismanaged, kept piling up. Liberia started to get worse from leadership of poor choices devoid of long-term vision. Firstly, Weah's government turned rapidly to borrowing. By 2021, total public debt had surged to about $1.8 billion, the highest amount since the post-debt relief era. Domestic debt from central bank borrowing and sovereign bonds ballooned. External debt to multilateral and bilateral creditors rose by leaps. Rather than financing infrastructure, education, healthcare, and production, much of the borrowing was used to plug short-term holes like salary payments, emergency expenditures, and deficient financing, leaving little for genuine structural investment. By 2023, the strain became evident. Nearly 13% of the national budget was projected to go just into servicing debt. This borrowing binge undetermined future growth, creating a legacy of debt for the next generation. A central pillar of his platform was attracting private and foreign direct investment under a pro-poor agenda. Instead, FDI collapsed dramatically as a sharp contrast with prior regimes. By 2022, according to a UN investment report, Liberia had attracted only $60 million in FDI. The country's ranking on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index worsened from 172 in 2017 to 175 by 2019. Without fresh investment, the private sector stalled, job creation dried up, and Liberia became a place where ambition suffocated under economic stagnation. Instead of a bustling economic revival, the country slipped into a vacuum with no growth, recovery, and just mounting despair. Almost immediately during Weah's tenure, inflation soared from a pre-election 12% in 2017 to 23.6% in 2018, then 27% in 2019. The Liberian dollar depreciated sharply, while import-dependent goods like food staples, fuel, and medicines skyrocketed, worsening the purchasing power of ordinary Liberians. Weah's government tried quick fixes with a cash injection and printing new currency. Moves meant to prop up liquidity and curb inflation. But these turned out to worsen the problem. Liquidity flooding the market without real production or export growth only deepened depreciation and inflationary pressure. For ordinary people, life became a daily struggle. Wages stagnated while prices became ridiculous. Food became unaffordable. Basic goods disappeared or became luxuries. Meanwhile, Weah had promised timely and fair pay to public servants, a critical promise for many ordinary Liberians. But instead, the bloated recurrent expenditure and debt servicing forced the government to prioritize survival over service delivery. Pledges to shrink the wage bill and restore fiscal discipline were never matched with structural reforms. Instead, the wage bill remained high even as revenue fell and debt grew. Civil servants who were once hopeful increasingly found themselves paid late or just not at all. For many, their paychecks became meaningless against inflation. The backbone of the state, including teachers, nurses, and public workers, found themselves abandoned. What was meant as social uplift turned into systemic neglect. Weah campaigned on fighting corruption, but under his watch, key top officials in his government, senior ministers, and high-ranking public servants were sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for corruption. A large-scale currency injection program meant to stabilize the Liberian dollar ended in scandal. A subsequent audit by the General Auditing Commission found major disbursement discrepancies, missing funds, and irregular transactions. Despite such glaring corruption, there was little accountability. Few prosecutions, minimal transparency, and growing public perception that corruption was now institutionalized rather than fought. As debt increased and services collapsed, many came to believe that borrowing and debt were tools not for national development, but for lining pockets. The government he promised would cleanse the state instead deepened the rot, replacing systemic poverty with systemic theft. Beyond mismanagement and corruption, the deeper failure was a lack of vision. Under Weah, key sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and services all shrank. Opportunities for jobs, growth, and development disappeared. As economic output declined, tax revenue and state capacity dwindled, creating a vicious cycle where fewer resources led to more borrowing, which led to deeper crises. Social indicators worsened. Poverty increased. Many Liberians fell into extreme hardship. Human development indexes dropped. In other words, the leap from football hero to head of state revealed a man unprepared unprepared for the subtle, grinding demands of national governance. The cumulative weight of these failures manifested around 2019 to 2020. Inflation and cost of living surged, pushing many Liberians into poverty, even those previously just about surviving. Protests started and thousands marched against what many saw as a betrayal of hope. At this point, the dream of social mobility faded fast. Reports of corruption, missing funds, opaque contracts, and fiscal recklessness replaced the narratives of transparency and accountability. Weah now stumbled under the weight of unfulfilled promises, mismanagement, and institutional decay. When the economy slid, Weah repeatedly sought help and legitimacy from abroad, and alternately leaned on international institutions and bilateral partners, while also making political choices at home that undercut technical fixes. In 2018, Weah made a high-profile visit to China and hailed expected grants and cooperation. He attended the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and publicly framed the China trip as a major diplomatic win. That courting of bilateral aid was part of a pattern to look outward to secure quick inflows rather than undertake difficult domestic reforms. At times when the economy was under strain, Weah spent significant periods abroad. For example, during the 2023 campaign period, AP reported he was out of the country for several weeks. People used these absences to question his focus on governance during crisis moments. Even as audits and scandals surfaced, Weah often stood by or shuffled implicated officials rather than delivering prosecutions or transparent dismissals. By 2023 and into 2024, the narrative became tougher. The man who once embodied national uplift now faced a public convinced he had presided over years that worsened ordinary Liberians' lives. Someone who once paid players' wages from his pocket and handed out cash on the streets was now accused by opponents in some institutions of presiding over an era of fiscal shortcuts, poor oversight, and policy failures. The crowd that once chanted his name began to ask for accountability. The transition from beloved son of the street to political pariah was the consequence of macroeconomic trends, policy choices, institutional weaknesses, and a public that expected rapid improvement and got slower, uncertain progress instead. As investigations tightened and foreign loans arrived with painful reform conditions, everything came down to this. Would George Weah face legal accountability, political ruin, or a last-minute path to redemption? And could Liberia recover fast enough to avoid social collapse? Or was this only the beginning of a deeper unraveling?